In a small, quiet town surrounded by green hills and tall trees, life moved at its own gentle pace. People knew each other by name, and the streets were filled with laughter, chatter, and the smell of fresh bread from the local bakery. At the heart of this town stood the Rustic Spoon, a cozy little diner where everyone loved to gather for a warm meal or just to catch up on gossip. It wasn't fancy, just wooden tables, mismatched chairs, and walls painted in soft pastel colors, but it had a charm that made people feel welcome. Clara was one of the waitresses at the Rustic Spoon, and she had been working there since she turned 18. She wasn't rich, nor did she dream of becoming famous. Her days were simple. Wake up early, work long hours at the diner, share her tiny apartment with her best friend Mia, and spend her evenings volunteering at the community center. Life wasn't easy for Clara, but she didn't complain. Instead, she found joy in helping others. Whether it was serving coffee to tired travelers or reading bedtime stories to kids at the center, Clara always went out of her way to make someone's day brighter. One rainy afternoon, as drops of water splattered against the diner windows, Clara was busy rushing between tables, balancing plates of food and cups of steaming tea. The place wasn't packed, but there were enough customers to keep her on her toes. As she turned toward the counter to grab another order, something caught her eye. A boy sitting alone at a corner table near the window. He looked about 10 years old, maybe younger, dressed in clothes that seemed too big for his slender frame. His jacket looked expensive, like something you'd see in glossy magazines, but it didn't fit the vibe of the humble diner. Still, what really drew Clara's attention was the look on his face. He wasn't looking at the menu or fidgeting like most kids would. Instead, he stared out the window, his eyes distant and sad, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Curious, Clara walked over to him after finishing up with her other customers. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. Kneeling beside his table, she gave him a warm smile. "Hey there," she said softly. "You okay? You've been sitting here for a while." The boy glanced at her, surprised, as if he hadn't noticed anyone else in the room. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure whether to speak. Then, almost reluctantly, he nodded. "I'm fine," he murmured, though his tone suggested otherwise. Clara tilted her head slightly, studying him. There was something fragile about him, like a bird with broken wings trying to hide its pain. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. "You don't have to be scared, you know. I'm just here to help." After a pause, the boy finally spoke. "My name's Ethan," he said quietly. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "Well, Ethan," Clara replied with a reassuring grin, "it's nice to meet you. Can I get you something to eat? We've got some amazing pancakes today." Ethan shook his head. "I don't have any money," he admitted, looking down at his hands. Clara's heart sank. She could tell right away that this kid wasn't just skipping school or having a bad day. Something deeper was going on. Without missing a beat, she stood up and grabbed a menu. "Don't worry about that," she said brightly. "Let's pick something out together, okay? My treat." At first, Ethan resisted, mumbling something about not wanting to bother her, but Clara wouldn't take no for an answer. She sat across from him, flipping through the menu and pointing out different items until a faint smile broke through his gloomy expression. Eventually, he settled on chocolate chip pancakes with a glass of milk. As they waited for the food, Clara tried to strike up a conversation. "So, Ethan," she began casually, "what brings you to our little diner today?" For a second, Ethan froze, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of the table. Then slowly, he started talking. He told her how he felt lonely all the time, even though he lived in a big house with everything he could ever want. He mentioned his father, who worked constantly and traveled so much that Ethan barely saw him. "It's like he doesn't care," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "He gives me stuff, but it's not the same. I just wanted to leave." Clara listened carefully, her chest tightening with every word. She understood loneliness better than anyone. Growing up, she had often felt invisible, like no one truly noticed her struggles. And now, here was this boy, carrying burdens far heavier than any child should. She reached across the table and placed a hand over his. "Ethan," she said firmly, "you're not alone anymore. Not while I'm around, okay? Things might seem tough right now, but trust me, they'll get better." When the pancakes arrived, Ethan dug in hungrily, his earlier sadness giving way to moments of genuine happiness. They talked about books, movies, and silly jokes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan laughed. Watching him, Clara couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. Little did she know, this chance encounter would change both their lives in ways neither of them could imagine. The next morning, Clara woke up thinking about Ethan. His face lingered in her mind, those big, sad eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. She couldn't shake off the feeling that something was deeply wrong. A kid like him didn't just wander into a diner alone on a rainy afternoon without a reason. There had to be more to his story, but she also knew better than to push too hard. Kids like Ethan, kids who were hurting, needed time and trust before they opened up completely. When she arrived at the Rustic Spoon later that day, she half expected him to show up again. And sure enough, around noon, the bell above the door jingled, and there he was. This time he wasn't sitting alone in the corner. He walked straight toward her, his steps hesitant but determined. "Hi," he said softly, clutching a small backpack tightly against his chest. Clara smiled warmly, putting down the tray she was holding. "Hey, Ethan. I was wondering if you'd come back. Did you sleep okay?" He nodded quickly, though his expression betrayed the lie. "Yeah, I slept fine." She could tell he was lying, but instead of calling him out, she simply gestured to an empty booth near the window. "Why don't we sit over here? I've got some hot chocolate ready for you." Ethan's eyes lit up slightly at the mention of hot chocolate. He followed her to the table and slid into the seat, setting his backpack beside him. As Clara poured him a steaming mug, she noticed how protective he was of the bag, keeping one hand on it as if guarding its contents. It made her wonder what was inside, but she didn't ask. Instead, she focused on making him feel comfortable. So, she began lightly, sliding the mug toward him. "Did you finish your homework yesterday, or are you playing hooky?" She winked playfully, trying to keep the mood light. Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm not in school right now," he admitted quietly, wrapping both hands around the mug. The warmth seemed to comfort him, and for a moment he looked less guarded. Clara raised an eyebrow but kept her tone casual. "Oh, really? Taking a little break?" "I guess you could say that," he muttered, staring into the swirling liquid. After a pause, he added, "I don't think my dad would even notice if I went to school or not." Her heart sank hearing that. It wasn't uncommon for kids to feel neglected by busy parents, but there was something in Ethan's voice, a mix of sadness and resignation, that tugged at her soul. She leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting on the table. "Listen, Ethan," she said gently. "Parents can get caught up in their work sometimes. That doesn't mean they don't care about you. Sometimes they just forget how important it is to stop and listen." Ethan shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "Maybe, but it's not just about listening. He's never home. Even when he is, he's always on his phone or talking to people about business." He rolled his eyes at the word, clearly frustrated. "It's like I'm invisible." Clara sighed, wishing she could fix everything for him. She wanted to tell him that things would magically improve, that his dad would suddenly realize what mattered most. But life wasn't that simple, and she knew giving false hope wouldn't help. Instead, she decided to focus on what she could do. Be there for him. "Well," she said with a soft smile, "you're not invisible to me, and as long as you're here, I'll make sure you feel seen and heard. Deal?" Ethan looked up at her, surprise flickering across his face. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether to believe her. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay. Deal." Over. The next few days, Ethan became a regular at the Rustic Spoon. Every afternoon, he'd arrive carrying his trusty backpack, and every time, Clara would greet him with a warm smile and a fresh cup of hot chocolate or milkshake. They developed a routine. He'd sit at his usual spot by the window and she'd join him whenever she had a free moment. Their conversations ranged from lighthearted topics like favorite movies and superhero powers to deeper discussions about feelings and fears. One day, while flipping through a worn-out deck of cards she kept behind the counter, Clara introduced Ethan to a game she used to play as a child. "Ever heard of Crazy Eights?" she asked, shuffling the cards with practiced ease. He shook his head, intrigued. "Nope. How do you play?" "It's easy," she said, dealing out the cards. "You try to get rid of all your cards before the other person does. If you can't play a card, you have to pick one from the pile. Simple, right?" Ethan grinned, picking up his hand. "Sounds fun. Let's go." They played round after round, laughing and teasing each other whenever someone got stuck with a bad card. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan seemed genuinely happy. The tension in his shoulders eased and his laughter filled the cozy diner, drawing smiles from the other customers. But even amidst the joy, Clara couldn't ignore the underlying sadness that occasionally crept back into his eyes. One afternoon, after losing yet another game of Crazy Eights, Ethan sighed dramatically and slumped back in his chair. "You cheat," he accused jokingly, though there was a hint of frustration in his tone. Clara laughed, leaning back against the booth. "I don't cheat, you're just a sore loser." "Am not," he protested, but the corners of his mouth twitched upward, betraying his amusement. After a beat, his expression turned serious. "Clara, can I ask you something?" "Of course," she replied, sensing the shift in his mood. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated, fiddling with the edge of a napkin. Do you think anyone will ever miss me if I leave?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she struggled to find the words. Finally, she reached across the table and placed a hand over his. "Ethan," she said firmly, "I would miss you. And I'm sure there are others who would too, even if they don't show it right now. Don't ever doubt that you matter, okay? Because you do." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes, but he blinked them away quickly, embarrassed. "Thanks," he mumbled, looking down at the table. "You don't have to thank me," Clara replied softly. "Just promise me one thing." "What?" "That you won't run away again. Not until we figure things out together. Deal?" After a long pause, Ethan nodded. "Deal." As the days passed, their bond grew stronger. Clara continued to support him in small but meaningful ways, teaching him card tricks, sharing stories from her own childhood, and reminding him that he wasn't alone. Meanwhile, Ethan began opening up more, revealing bits and pieces of his life that painted a clearer picture of why he felt so lost. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues through the diner windows, Ethan finally confessed something that changed everything. "My dad," he started hesitantly, trailing off. Clara waited patiently, encouraging him with a nod. "What about your dad?" He's kind of famous," Ethan admitted, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "People know him. Like, a lot of people." Curious, Clara tilted her head. "Famous how?" Ethan swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable. "He owns companies and stuff. Big ones. People call him one of the richest men alive." Clara froze, processing his words. Suddenly, the expensive clothes, the guarded demeanor, it all made sense. But instead of letting shock take over, she focused on Ethan. "Wow," she said simply. "That must be overwhelming." "It is," he whispered. "Everyone expects so much from him, and from me too. But all I want is for him to notice. You need to actually be there." Clara squeezed his hand reassuringly. "I understand, Ethan, I really do. And I promise we'll figure this out together. Okay?" Ethan nodded, a glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. Little did either of them know, this revelation would set off a chain of events neither of them could have predicted. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan's visits to the rustic spoon became a constant in Clara's life. Their bond deepened with each passing day, and she found herself looking forward to their afternoons together. There was something about Ethan, his quiet resilience, his sharp mind, and his surprising sense of humor, that made her feel like she was making a real difference. But even as they grew closer, Clara couldn't shake the nagging worry that lingered in the back of her mind. Ethan had opened up about his father being one of the richest men alive, but he hadn't said much beyond that. He avoided talking about specifics, brushing off questions with vague answers or changing the subject entirely. Clara didn't push him too hard. She knew trust took time, especially for someone who felt so isolated. Still, she couldn't help but wonder what it must be like to grow up in a world where everyone expected so much from you, not because of who you were, but because of your last name. One afternoon, as they sat at their usual table by the window, Clara decided to broach the topic again. She didn't want to pry, but she needed to know more if she was going to help him navigate this situation. "Hey, Ethan," she began casually, stirring sugar into her coffee. "You ever think about going back home? Not forever, maybe just to talk things out with your dad?" Ethan froze, his spoon hovering over his bowl of ice cream. For a moment, he looked like a deer caught in headlights, unsure of how to respond. Then, slowly, he set the spoon down and stared at the table. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "What if he doesn't care? What if nothing changes?" Clara reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Ethan, I can't promise that everything will magically get better overnight. But I do know this. Running away isn't the answer. You deserve to have a say in your own life, to tell your dad how you feel and why it matters to you." He sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "It's not that easy. My dad, he's always busy. Even when he's home, he's not really there. And when I try to talk to him, it's like he doesn't hear me." "I get that," Clara said softly. "But sometimes people need a little push to wake up. Maybe all it takes is one honest conversation to make him realize what's important." Ethan chewed on his lower lip, clearly torn. Part of him wanted to believe Clara, to hope that things could change. But another part, the part that had been let down too many times before, was afraid to take the risk. "What if I mess it up?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I say the wrong thing?" Clara smiled gently. "There's no perfect way to do it, Ethan. Just speak from your heart. Trust me, honesty goes a long way." For a while, neither of them spoke. The hum of conversations around them faded into the background as Ethan wrestled with his thoughts. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice steadier now. "Maybe you're right, but I don't know where to start." "We'll figure it out together," Clara promised. "How about we write a letter? Sometimes it's easier to put your feelings into words when you're not face to face." Ethan hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Yeah, maybe that could work." Over the next few days, they worked on the letter during Ethan's visits to the diner. Clara encouraged him to pour his heart onto the page, reminding him that there was no right or wrong way to express himself. At first, Ethan struggled, erasing entire sentences and starting over multiple times, but as he continued, his words began to flow more freely. By the end of it, the letter was raw and honest, a heartfelt plea for understanding and connection. When they finished, Ethan folded the paper carefully and slipped it into an envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he sealed it, and Clara could see the mix of fear and determination in his eyes. "Do you think he'll read it?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "He'd be crazy not to," Clara replied firmly. "This letter comes straight from your heart, Ethan. Any parent would want to hear what you have to say." Though Ethan seemed reassured, Clara couldn't ignore the growing unease in her chest. She knew that sending the letter was just the first step, and that whatever happened next could change both their lives forever. Still, she pushed those thoughts aside for now, focusing instead on supporting Ethan through this difficult process. Meanwhile, news of a missing child had begun spreading through the town. Flyers with Ethan's picture appeared on lampposts and bulletin boards urging anyone with information to come forward. Clara recognized the photo immediately. It was Ethan, smiling brightly in a family portrait. The caption beneath the image described him as the son of a wealthy businessman, offering a hefty reward for his safe return. At first, Clara debated whether to contact the authorities. She knew keeping Ethan's whereabouts a secret wasn't the right thing to do, but she also understood why he had run away in the first place. Turning him in without his consent felt like betraying his trust. Instead, she decided to focus on helping him reconnect with his father on his own terms. Late one night, after closing up the diner, Clara sat alone at one of the tables, staring at her phone. Her mind raced with questions. Who exactly was Ethan's father? How powerful was he? And what would happen once he found out where his son was? She pulled up a search engine and typed in the name listed on the flyer, Richard Langley. As page after page of results loaded, Clara's jaw dropped. Richard Langley wasn't just rich. He was one of the most influential men in the country. His company spanned industries, his wealth was unimaginable, and his name was synonymous with success. Yet despite all that, he remained notoriously private, rarely appearing in public or giving interviews. Clara scrolled through article after article, piecing together fragments of his life. She learned about his rise to power, his ruthless business tactics, and the rumors of strained relationships within his family. The more she read, the clearer it became why Ethan felt so disconnected from his father. But she also saw glimpses of vulnerability, a rare interview where Richard spoke about balancing work and family, a charity event he attended with his son by his side. These moments suggested that beneath the tough exterior, there was still a man capable of love and regret. As dawn broke outside the diner windows, Clara closed her laptop, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. She realized now that Ethan's situation was far more complicated than she had initially thought. Helping him wouldn't just mean bridging the gap between father and son, it would mean navigating a world of privilege and power that she had never encountered before. But Clara wasn't one to back down from a challenge. If anything, learning about Richard Langley only strengthened her resolve to help Ethan. She reminded herself that no matter how wealthy or powerful someone might be, they were still human, and humans made mistakes. All she could do was guide Ethan toward reconciliation and hope that his father would rise to the occasion. The next morning, as Ethan walked into the diner carrying his backpack, Clara greeted him with a warm smile. "Ready for another round of crazy eights?" she asked, holding up the deck of cards. Ethan grinned, sliding into his usual seat. "You're gonna lose this time," he teased, though his eyes sparkled with mischief. Clara laughed, shuffling the cards. "We'll see about that." As they played, she couldn't help but marvel at how far they'd come since that rainy afternoon weeks ago. From a lonely boy seeking refuge to a budding friendship built on trust and kindness, their journey was proof that even the smallest acts of compassion could create ripples of change. Little did Clara know, those ripples were about to turn into waves. The days that followed were a blur of emotions for Clara. On one hand, she felt proud of Ethan for taking the brave step of writing the letter to his father. It wasn't easy for anyone, let alone a child, to lay bare their feelings so honestly. But on the other hand, she couldn't shake the anxiety gnawing at her. What if Richard Langley didn't respond? Or worse, what if he reacted in a way that crushed Ethan's fragile hope? Every time the bell above the diner door jingled, Clara found herself glancing up, half expecting someone important to walk in, a private investigator, a lawyer, or even Richard himself. Yet life at the Rustic Spoon carried on as usual. Regular customers chatted over coffee, plates clattered in the kitchen, and laughter echoed through the room. For now, the storm brewing outside their little bubble remained unseen. Ethan, too, seemed caught between anticipation and dread. He came to the diner every day, just like before, but there was an underlying tension in his demeanor. His jokes lacked their usual spark, and his smiles didn't reach his eyes. Clara noticed it immediately. One afternoon, as they sat together, playing Crazy Eights, she finally decided to address it. "Hey," she said softly, placing a card on the table. "You've been quiet today. Everything okay?" Ethan hesitated, staring at his cards without really seeing them. After a moment, he shrugged. "I don't know, I guess I'm just waiting." "For your dad?" Clara asked gently. He nodded, chewing on his lower lip. "Yeah. I keep thinking about what he'll say when he gets the letter. What if he doesn't care? Or what if he gets mad?" Clara reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand over his. "Ethan, listen to me. Your dad might be busy, and maybe he hasn't always been there for you. But no parent wants to lose their child. That letter will make him stop and think. Trust me, it's impossible to read something like that and not feel anything." Ethan looked up at her, searching her face for reassurance. Finally, he gave a small nod. "I hope you're right." "I am," Clara said firmly, though inside she wasn't entirely sure. She hated lying to him, but she also knew that doubt would only make things harder. Instead, she focused on keeping his spirits high, distracting him with games, stories, and silly jokes whenever his mood dipped. But while Clara tried to stay optimistic for Ethan's sake, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease in her own heart. Late at night, after closing up the diner, she often found herself scrolling through news articles about Richard Langley. The more she learned about him, the more conflicted she felt. On paper, he was a towering figure, a self-made billionaire who had built an empire from scratch. People admired him for his intelligence, his ambition, and his ability to dominate industries. Yet beneath the polished exterior, there were whispers of a man consumed by work, whose personal life had suffered as a result. One article stood out to Clara. It was an old interview where Richard spoke briefly about his family. When asked about balancing his career with being a father, his response had been curt. "Success demands sacrifice. You can't have everything." At the time, the comment had sparked controversy, with critics accusing him of prioritizing wealth over relationships. Reading it now, Clara understood why Ethan felt invisible. How could a kid compete with such relentless ambition? Despite everything, Clara refused to judge Richard outright. She reminded herself that people weren't defined solely by their public personas, or their mistakes. Maybe he regretted the choices he'd made. Maybe he wanted to change but didn't know how. Whatever the case, Clara hoped that Ethan's letter would serve as a wake-up call, forcing him to confront the damage he'd caused. Then, one chilly morning, the unexpected happened. Clara was wiping down tables when the bell above the door rang. She glanced up automatically, expecting to see another local customer. Instead, her breath caught in her throat. Standing in the doorway was a man unlike anyone she'd ever seen before. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, with silver-streaked hair and piercing blue eyes, he exuded an air of authority that filled the room. For a moment, everyone froze. Even the cook poked his head out of the kitchen to see what the commotion was about. The man scanned the diner slowly, his gaze landing on Clara. Without hesitation, he walked toward her, his steps measured and deliberate. Clara's heart raced as she set down her rag and straightened up, unsure of what to expect. "Are you Clara?" he asked, his voice deep and commanding yet tinged with exhaustion. "Yes," she replied cautiously, her pulse quickening. "Can I help you?" The man nodded, extending a hand. "My name is Richard Langley. I believe we need to talk." For a split second, Clara considered denying any knowledge of Ethan, but looking into Richard's eyes, she saw something that stopped her cold. Not anger or arrogance, but raw vulnerability. This wasn't the untouchable billionaire she'd read about. This was a father desperate to find his son. "Of course," she said finally, gesturing toward an empty booth. "Please sit down." As they settled into the booth, Richard removed his coat and folded it neatly beside him. Up close, he looked older than his photos suggested, with lines etched deeply into his face and shadows under his eyes. Clearly, the search for Ethan had taken its toll. "I assume you know who I am?" he began, his tone clipped but weary. "And I assume you know where my son is?" Clara nodded slowly, choosing her words carefully. "Yes, I do. But before we go any further, I want to make one thing clear. Ethan came to me because he needed someone to trust. He's scared, hurt, and confused, and none of this is his fault. Richard flinched slightly at her words, guilt flickering across his features. I understand, he said quietly. Believe me, I never meant for things to get this far. I thought I was providing for him, giving him everything he needed. But clearly... His voice trailed off, heavy with regret. Clara studied him closely, trying to gauge whether his remorse was genuine. Mr. Langley, she said evenly, Ethan doesn't need everything. He needs you. Not your money, not your success, just your presence. Do you think you can give him that? Richard hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the table, tightly. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked with emotion. I don't know if I can fix what I've broken, but I swear to you, I'll try. I've spent my entire life chasing success, thinking it would protect my family. Now I realize it's done the opposite. All I want is a chance to make things right, with Ethan and with myself. Tears pricked at the corners of Clara's eyes, though she blinked them away quickly. She had expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even denial. What she hadn't anticipated was this, a broken man willing to admit his flaws and beg for forgiveness. All right, she said softly. Let me bring him here. But remember, this isn't about you anymore. It's about him. Richard nodded, his expression softening. Thank you. For everything. Clara rose from the booth and headed toward the back room, where Ethan had been coloring quietly while waiting for her to finish cleaning. As she approached, her heart ached for the boy, who had endured so much pain at such a young age. Taking a deep breath, she knelt beside him and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Ethan, she said softly, there's someone here to see you. Ethan's eyes widened with alarm. Who? It's your dad, Clara replied, keeping her tone calm and steady. He's come to talk to you. Are you ready? Ethan froze, his pencil slipping from his fingers. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, fear and hope warring in his expression. Then, slowly, he nodded. Okay, he whispered. Taking his hand, Clara led him back to the booth where Richard sat waiting. As they approached, Ethan hesitated, clinging to her side. Clara gave his hand a reassuring squeeze before stepping back, allowing father and son to face each other. Richard stood up, his posture rigid but his eyes brimming with tears. Ethan, he said hoarsely, I'm so sorry. At first, Ethan didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, his grip on Clara's hand tightening. Then, slowly, he took a tentative step forward. Dad? He murmured, his voice trembling. That single word broke Richard. Tears streamed down his face as he opened his arms, and without another word, Ethan ran into them. Father and son embraced fiercely, years of missed moments and unspoken words pouring out in that one hug. Clara stepped back, watching silently as the scene unfolded. Her chest swelled with emotion, pride mingling with relief. She had played a small part in bringing them back together, but the real work was just beginning. As the embrace lingered, Richard pulled back slightly, cupping Ethan's face in his hands. I promise you, son, things are going to change. No more excuses, no more running away. We'll figure this out, together. Ethan nodded, sniffling but smiling through his tears. Okay, Dad. Clara couldn't help but smile too. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the diner and the love of two people finding their way back to each other, she felt a profound sense of purpose. Life wasn't perfect, and neither were people, but sometimes all it took was a little kindness to set things on the right path. The reunion between Ethan and his father was raw and emotional, but it wasn't the end of their journey. It was only the beginning. Richard Langley may have come to the diner that day with a heart full of regret, but Clara knew that apologies alone wouldn't fix years of neglect. Actions would speak louder than words, and she intended to hold him accountable for keeping his promises. After the initial embrace, Richard stayed at the Rustic Spoon for nearly an hour, talking quietly, with Ethan while Clara gave them space. She busied herself wiping down tables and refilling coffee cups for other customers, though her attention kept drifting back to the booth where father and son sat together. Richard's demeanor had shifted completely. Gone was the imposing businessman who walked in earlier. In his place was a man humbled by love, a father trying desperately to reconnect with his child. Eventually, Richard approached Clara as he prepared to leave with Ethan. "Thank you," he said sincerely, his voice still thick with emotion. "I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you for what you've done." Clara shook her head, brushing off the gratitude. "You don't owe me anything. Just make sure Ethan knows how much he means to you from now on. That's all the thanks I need." Richard nodded solemnly. "I will. I promise." As they left the diner hand in hand, Clara couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and apprehension. While she trusted Richard's intentions, she also knew that rebuilding trust wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and consistency, and she hoped he was ready for the challenge. Over the next few weeks, life in the small town began to settle into a new rhythm. Flyers about Ethan disappeared from lampposts, replaced by whispers of gratitude among locals who were relieved the boy had been found safe. Meanwhile, Clara noticed subtle changes in Ethan's behavior during their daily visits to the rustic spoon. He seemed lighter somehow, more at ease. His laughter came easier, and the sadness that once clouded his eyes began to fade. But what surprised Clara most was how often Richard showed up alongside him. At first, these visits were brief, just enough time for Richard to order a cup of coffee or share a meal with Ethan before heading off to another meeting. But gradually those visits grew longer. Richard started asking questions about Clara's life, her work at the diner, and her volunteer efforts at the community center. There was genuine curiosity in his tone, a desire to understand the world, beyond boardrooms and balance sheets. One afternoon, after Ethan excused himself to play video games on Clara's phone, Richard leaned forward in his seat and spoke candidly. "I owe you more than just a thank you, Clara," he admitted, his expression earnest. "You stepped in when no one else could, or would. You saw my son, not as some spoiled kid with a famous last name, but as a person who needed guidance and care. I can't tell you how much that means to me." Clara shrugged modestly, though warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I didn't do anything special. I just did what anyone would have done if they saw someone struggling." "No," Richard insisted firmly. "Not everyone would have done what you did. Most people would have turned Ethan over to the authorities, without a second thought. But you chose kindness instead of judgment. That's rare." His praise made her uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being put on a pedestal, but she appreciated the sincerity behind it. "Well, I'm glad things worked out," she replied simply. "Ethan deserves happiness, and so do you." Richard sighed, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "That's the thing. I'm not sure I deserve it. Not after everything I've put him through. But I'm going to try, Clara. For the first time in years, I'm going to prioritize being a father over being a CEO." She studied him closely, noting the determination in his eyes. "Good," she said finally, "because Ethan needs you, not your money or your success, but you. And honestly, so do you. People are happiest when they're connected to something bigger than themselves." Her words lingered in the air, and Richard nodded slowly as if absorbing their weight. "You're wise beyond your years," he remarked with a faint smile. "Have you ever thought about doing something bigger with your life? Something that lets you help even more people?" Clara chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I'm just a waitress, Mr. Langley. My job is to serve pancakes and refill coffee mugs, not save the world." "Call me Richard," he corrected gently. "And don't sell yourself short. What you've done here, what you continue to do every day, is extraordinary. You inspire others without even realizing it." Though Clara dismissed his comments as polite flattery, Richard clearly meant what he said. Over the following weeks, he proved it by taking steps to integrate himself into the community. First, he discreetly donated funds to renovate the rustic spoon, replacing worn-out furniture and upgrading the kitchen equipment. Then, he began supporting local businesses, investing in projects that created jobs and boosted the town's economy. None of this was done publicly. Richard preferred to stay out of the spotlight, letting his actions speak for themselves. For Clara, watching Richard transform was fascinating. He wasn't perfect. He still struggled to balance his demanding career with family life. But he was trying. More importantly, he was listening. When Ethan expressed interest in joining the school soccer team, Richard rearranged his schedule to attend practices and games. When Ethan complained about feeling disconnected from classmates, Richard encouraged him to invite friends over for movie nights or sleepovers. Slowly but surely, the gap between them began to close. Meanwhile, Clara continued to play a pivotal role in both their lives. Though Ethan spent more time at home now, he still visited the Rustic Spoon regularly, often bringing Richard along. Their shared meals became a tradition, a chance for them to bond over plates of pancakes and stories of their day. Clara loved seeing how far they'd come since that rainy afternoon when Ethan first walked into the diner alone. One evening, after closing up shop, Clara found herself sitting across from Richard at one of the booths. Ethan had gone home early, leaving the two of them to talk. The conversation started casually enough, with Richard asking about Clara's plans for the future. But as the night wore on, it deepened, touching on topics like purpose, fulfillment, and the impact one person could have on the world. "You know," Richard said thoughtfully, swirling the remnants of his coffee in its mug, "you remind me of someone I used to know. A mentor of mine, actually. He always said that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, it's measured in the lives you touch." Clara smiled wryly. "Sounds like something you'd hear on a motivational poster." Richard laughed, but his gaze remained steady. "Maybe. But it's true. Look at what you've done for Ethan, and for me. You've reminded me of what really matters, and I want to pay that forward." Before Clara could respond, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. Sliding it across the table, he added, "If you're interested, I'd like to offer you a position managing my charitable foundation. It's something I've neglected for too long, but under your leadership, I think it could make a real difference." Clara stared at the card, stunned. Managing a billionaire's foundation? It sounded like a dream job, but also terrifying. She glanced up at Richard, unsure of what to say. I don't know. I've never done anything like that before." "That's exactly why I want you," Richard replied firmly. "You bring authenticity to everything you do. You see people, Clara, all of them, not just the ones who fit neatly into boxes. That's a gift, and it's exactly what my foundation needs." His confidence in her was overwhelming, but Clara couldn't ignore the flicker of excitement that sparked within her. For years, she'd dreamed of doing more, of using her passion for helping others on a larger scale. Could this be her chance? "I'll think about it," she promised, tucking the card into her apron pocket. "But no pressure, okay?" "None at all," Richard assured her with a smile. "Just know that the offer stands whenever you're ready." As she locked up the diner, later that night, Clara found herself replaying the conversation in her mind. Was she brave enough to step into a role like that? To leave behind the familiarity of the Rustic Spoon and venture into uncharted territory? The thought scared her, but it also thrilled her. Little did she realize, this decision would mark the start of a new chapter in her life, one that intertwined her fate with Richard and Ethan's in ways she couldn't yet imagine. For now, though, she focused on the present. A quiet town, a cozy diner, and a friendship that had blossomed into something extraordinary.